Chapter 3 of The Hunger Games opens with Katniss being taken into a private room in order to say her goodbyes to her loved ones in the 1 hour that is allotted to them before they are taken to the games. And throughout this chapter, we get more insight into how the Capitol controls the games, controls the message, and has also managed to indoctrinate an entire nation, including Katniss herself. Many tributes have tried to escape in the past. I've never seen that happen though. The Capitol controls the message that districts see. They have broadcast nearly every single aspect of the Hunger Games for everyone's consumption, but they don't show people escaping, even though Katniss says that it has happened before. This is because the Capitol doesn't want to broadcast moments where they have lost control of the games. More importantly, I don't think they want to broadcast moments where it's very clear that tributes are not as active participants as they make the Capitol's citizens believe they are. Instead, the Capitol applauds the victors and hails them as a moment of glory in the games, focusing on that aspect rather than anything else. Throughout the chapter, Katniss also brings up previous Hunger Games that she has watched over the years, and we get some insight into what she might be facing. We spent one Hunger Games watching players freeze to death at night. You could hardly see them because they were just huddled in balls and had no wood or fires or torches or anything. It was considered very anticlimactic in the Capitol, all those quiet, bloodless deaths. This paragraph really highlights the Capitol's need to constantly reinvent the Hunger Games to keep it interesting for the Capitol citizens to watch. This idea was properly introduced to us in the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, with Snow becoming a game maker of sorts, suggesting ideas that would reinvent the Hunger Games and keep people entertained for years to come. And while it's a good insight, what I find most interesting about this paragraph is that Katniss refers to the Hunger Games tributes as players. We know that Katniss abhors the games. We know that she views the tributes as human beings, as children, and yet she has been so successfully indoctrinated by the Capitol that even she will still refer to the tributes as players, almost in a jovial, lighthearted manner in her mind. This casual terminology purports the idea that the Hunger Games are much more fun and enjoyable for the tributes than they actually are. But that's how especially the Capitol citizens view the Hunger Games, with an emphasis on games. And the terminology that Suzanne Collins uses throughout this chapter to refer to the Capitol citizens is very clever. We have to stand outside for a few minutes in the doorway of the train while the cameras gobble up our images. Then we're allowed inside and the doors close mercifully behind us. The use of the word gobble really feeds into the overindulgence of the Capitol citizens versus the starvation that is happening in the districts. They are literally feeding off of the tribute's pain. In the previous 2 chapters, we have established that Katniss is a character who will rarely look to care for herself and instead will care for others, and that is really emphasized to a heightened degree here. When Prim and her mother come to visit her, Katniss is so focused on their survival alone that she doesn't even take a minute to consider her own fate. She instructs Prim to use her goat, to trust Gale to bring them food and game, and to deal with fuel and trading. Katniss is very curt with her mother and very insistent that she not disappear again, because Katniss will not be there now to take care of Prim. And her mother responds quite defensively, saying that if she had the medicine that she has now then she would have been able to take care of herself. The part about her being ill might be true. I've seen her bring back people suffering from immobilizing sadness since. Perhaps it is a sickness, but it's one we can't afford. Katniss claims that her mother has since treated people for what we now know to be depression. And again, this is a major spoiler for the later books, but I find it very interesting and very telling of just how broken Katniss and her mother are after Prim's death, that Katniss's mother does not come to help Katniss when Katniss is suffering the same fate. But it is actually Prim who first brings up the fact that Katniss is going into the Hunger Games. "I'll be alright, Katniss," says Prim, clasping my face in her hands. "But you have to take care too. You're so fast and brave. Maybe you can win." "I can't win." Prim must know that in her heart. Here we realize that one of the reasons that Katniss hasn't been focusing on her own feelings and her own fate is because, like she always does, she has already accepted that her situation is dire. She isn't looking to the future like Gale would be, because she's already accepted that she doesn't have one. Throughout the entire interaction with her family, Katniss manages to keep it together, and the first time we actually get a look at her true emotions and her emotional state is after they've left. I bury my head in one of the velvet pillows as if this can block the whole thing out. She is visibly trying to hide herself and hide her eyes from the world that she is now in. But this is an impossible task because even the texture of the pillow is something that she has never felt before. Even with her eyes closed, she can still feel that this is a velvet pillow. It is something of luxury. It is very dissimilar to the rough canvas covers that she woke up with that morning. Even if she tries to bury her head in the proverbial sand, there is no going back from this. After Prim and her mother leave, Katniss gets a very surprising visitor in the form of Peeta's father, the baker. He offers Katniss a package of cookies and he doesn't really say much during their very short interaction. He sits in silence for the majority of the time until he has to leave, and he reassures Katniss that he will look after Prim. The baker is not a very talkative man in the best of times, and today he has no words at all. The little we learn about Peeta's father presents him as both a contrast and a parallel to his son. Peeta is a master of words. His father has very few. I do believe that Peeta's father, not being a very talkative man, has greatly impacted the person that Peeta has become, because one of the reasons that Peeta is such a good person at wooing crowds and being charismatic is because he is a very good listener and observer. It could be that he learnt this from his father, having to constantly pick up on non-verbal cues. And the way that Katniss interacts with each of the visitors who come to see her is very telling of her view of herself. People deal with me, but they are genuinely fond of Prim. Yet again, Katniss is not considering properly the fact that someone might have come to see her off because they care for her and like her. Rather, she assumes that it is because they love Prim. It sometimes makes you want to scream, "Katniss, people like you!" And this is no more evident than in her friendship with Madge. She just keeps to herself, like me. Since neither of us really has a group of friends, we seem to end up together a lot at school, eating lunch, sitting next to each other at assemblies, partnering for sports activities. We rarely talk, which suits us both fine. That was a passage from chapter 1, but I feel like it better suits this chapter because it really emphasizes here just how wrong Katniss's words are. In that passage alone, Katniss essentially defines what having a friend is while also claiming that she doesn't have any friends. Which is just another example of Katniss's words versus her actions being in direct conflict with each other. Madge also comes to visit Katniss and see her off to the games. But crucially, and this is a change from the movies, it is Madge who gives Katniss the Mockingjay pin. There's an urgency about her tone that surprises me. They let you wear one thing from your district in the arena, one thing to remind you of home. Will you wear this? She holds out the circular gold pin that was on her dress earlier. I hadn't paid much attention to it before, but now I see it's a small bird in flight. Why did Madge give Katniss the pin? There are many theories to this, and none that can be properly confirmed because unfortunately, spoiler alert, Madge does not make it to the end of the series. One idea could be that the pin not only acts as a talisman to home, but also presents Katniss as having a certain status symbol within her district that wouldn't normally be associated with District 12. The pin is made from gold, real gold as Katniss says, which people from the wealthier districts in the capital may not think that someone from District 12, especially from someone from the very poor part of District 12, might be able to afford. Madge could also see the pin as having an importance to Katniss herself. It shows a mockingjay, a songbird, and we know that Katniss and her father were known for having beautiful singing voices. Later in the chapter, Katniss describes her father often singing for the mockingjays and then repeating it back, and that the birds would always stop to listen to him. And later on, Peeta insinuates that many people knew about Katniss's father and his beautiful singing voice, and that everyone also knew that Katniss had a beautiful singing voice that everyone would stop to listen to. Perhaps Madge knew about this, and she wanted Katniss to have that connection to her father, that connection to home and that sense of peace with her while she was in the arena. Another theory is that this could be Madge's way of spiting the Capitol. They're funny birds and something of a slap in the face to the Capitol. Katniss goes on to describe the creation of the mockingjays, how the Capitol had created these genetically altered birds called jabberjays to act as spies on the districts during the dark days. When the districts caught wind of this, they started sending the Capitol false messages, and so the Capitol realized that the birds were useless, and so they sent them to die in the wild. Only the birds didn't die in the wild, they mated with the mockingbird and created mockingjays. And the story of the mockingjays as a whole not only paralleled the later discovery of District 13, but also humanity as a whole. These useless creatures, the jabberjays, were sent off into the wild to die, for surely they would die if not in a civilized society, only they didn't die. because they created a beautiful community and life for themselves. What the Capitol viewed as the ultimate punishment, to be sent off to die, the Jabberjays viewed as a sense of freedom to create new life and to flourish. Madge giving Katniss the pin could very well be her way of spiting the Capitol and mocking them. Then she's gone, and I'm left thinking that maybe Madge really has been my friend all along. We know, Katniss. We all know. Then we get to the third stunning Delort illustration. We have Madge pinning the Mockingjay pin to Katniss's dress, but what is quite crucial here is that we don't see Madge at all, nor do we see Katniss's full face. And I think it's quite indicative of the fact that it was never about one person leading this rebellion. Rather, it was a symbol. Katniss became a symbol that worked in tandem with the Mockingjay pin. We later learn that the rebellion has been brewing for years, and that they were just waiting for a spark to light the fuel, and that inevitably the rebellion likely would have happened within the next few years anyway. In short, it did not matter who was the symbol. It matters that there was a symbol. And that is what I think is so beautiful about this image alone, is that it emphasizes the fact that it isn't about Katniss or Madge, it is about the symbol itself. The pin itself is almost centered on the page. The fabric folds in Katniss's dress almost lead towards it, creating a sun-like image. Another aspect I love about this image is that Delort has added arrows into the Art Deco-like wallpaper behind Katniss. It's a subtle nod, but I really appreciate it. And then we get more insight into Gale and Katniss as a pairing and understand just how close and comforted they are by each other. He'll also bring them game. He and I made a pact about this a year or so ago, and will probably not ask for compensation, but they should thank him with some sort of trade, like milk or medicine. We're starting to understand here that Katniss views relationships as very transactional, despite the fact that she views Gale like family, and he views her like family, despite the fact that she knows he will not ask for compensation. Katniss still feels that she would owe him, that her family would owe him for keeping them alive. Gale is here, and maybe there's nothing romantic between us, but when he opens his arms, I don't hesitate to go into them. His body is familiar to me. The way it moves, the smell of wood smoke, even the sound of his heart beating I know from quiet moments on a hunt. But this is the first time I really feel it, lean and hard-muscled against my own. Gale is the first person that she lets herself be vulnerable with, that she goes up to immediately to hug and to feel comforted by. And from here on out, Katniss starts considering her time in the games and whether or not she actually can survive, which at this point she still does not believe she can. You've had more practice, real practice, he says. You know how to kill. Not people, I say. How different can it be, really, says Gale grimly. The awful thing is that if I can forget they're people, it'll be no different at all. Gale is the first person to point out that hunting people and hunting animals is not so different, but Katniss is very quick to agree. And it's clear that neither of them like that this is a reality they are now living in. Gale says it very grimly, and Katniss admits that it's an awful thing to admit. But both of them know this fact to be true because they think very alike, because they've worked in tandem for so many years now that they understand the other person so well, even their darkest thoughts. Don't let them starve, I cry out, clinging to his hand. I won't. You know I won't. Katniss, remember he says, and they yank us apart and slam the door, and I'll never know what it was he wanted me to remember. We never find out what it was that Gale wanted Katniss to remember, but there are a few theories that I have myself as to what he was planning on saying. Him saying, remember I love you, is probably the most obvious one, and it also is quite likely. We know that Gale has felt affection for Katniss and viewed them as a couple from the very beginning. We understand this. We understand it even clearer when Katniss comes back from the games and Gale is wildly jealous. Remember I will wait for you packs a bit more of a punch, but it also adds an unnecessary level of pressure and guilt to Katniss if she were to come back. Remember I believe in you is less guilt-ridden and slightly more hopeful, and something that I think Katniss would have appreciated hearing. Maybe not at the time, she probably wouldn't have believed it, but it would have been good for her to know that someone does believe she can win these games, because it is not until much later on, during an outburst with Peeta at the dinner table, that she understands that people do think she can win. Despite all these people visiting her, those closest to her who tell her that they believe that she can win, and those who she didn't even realize looked after up to her and were fond of her, gifting her presents. Despite all of that, with the heightened emotions and the tearful goodbyes, Katniss is still incredibly focused on not crying, on not showing her emotions, on not showing weakness. I've been right not to cry. The station is swarming with reporters with their insect-like cameras trained directly on my face. But I've had a lot of practice at wiping my face clean of emotions, and I do this now. I catch a glimpse of myself on the television screen on the wall that's airing my arrival live and feel gratified that I almost appear bored. Katniss does not want to appear weak or vulnerable at all, which is understandable, but will also not help her in the games, except for the other tributes taking her seriously. We later learn in this chapter that the best ally that you can have in the games are sponsors, because they can often bridge the line between life and death. But the issue with that is that sponsors are Capitol citizens, and they require entertainment and engagement from their tributes, not apathy. Unfortunately for Katniss, she is in survival mode, but the Hunger Games are not just about survival, they are also about spectacle. The two work in tandem with each other. Even so, Katniss is very pleased with the fact that she has managed to retain her emotions inside. Unlike Peeta. Peeta Mellark, on the other hand, has obviously been crying and interestingly enough does not seem to be trying to cover it up. I immediately wonder if this will be his strategy in the games. On the surface level, having been deep in Katniss's point of view for a while now, this makes sense. However, when you look at it from an outside point of view, it is very odd that Katniss is assuming that Peeta's crying is strategy rather than just emotion. This seems an odd strategy for Peeta Mellark because he's a baker's son. All those years of having enough to eat and hauling bread trays around had made him broad-shouldered and strong. It'll take an awful lot of weeping to convince anyone to overlook him. When Katniss even seems to admit to herself that the strategy of crying for attention won't really work for Peeta, she still doesn't consider the fact that it might not be a strategy. She sees emotion as a weapon because for her, it came to be that. Another main player we're properly introduced to in this chapter is Effie Trinket. Throughout the meal, Effie Trinket keeps reminding us to save space because there's more to come. But I'm stuffing myself because I've never had food like this. So good and so much. At least you two have decent manners, says Effie as we're finishing the main course. The pair last year ate everything with their hands like a couple of savages. It completely upset my digestion. It doesn't seem to occur to her that people might not have been taught proper table manners because they maybe didn't have full meals or even a table. Her concern at the moment seems to be exclusively for herself, and the fact that the tributes and the way they ate upset her stomach, rather than the fact that these tributes were so hungry they were inhaling their food. Because for her, it's a lack of manners rather than a lack of resources. And we later understand that this is more due to ignorance than it is malice, but we don't really understand that here. And this view of District 12 as being savages is not exclusive to Effie Trinket alone. It is actually quite widespread across the Capitol and likely the other wealthier districts. The commentators are not sure what to say about the crowd's refusal to applaud. The silent salute. One says that District 12 has always been a bit backward, but that local customs can be charming. This is incredibly patronizing and demeaning of an entire district's culture and traditions. It gives the impression that rather this being a district grieving and in mourning for the loss of loved ones, it is rather a district with just kooky traditions and customs. Effie Trinket is disgruntled about the state her wig was in. Your mentor has a lot to learn about presentation, a lot about televised behavior. Again, here, Effie is only concerned with her own appearance. She also puts the possession of Haymitch onto Katniss and Peeta, rather than himself or on her, as if Haymitch is Katniss and Peeta's responsibility. I can't help smirking a little. Effie Trinket makes it sound like Haymitch just has somewhat rough manners that can be corrected with a few tips from her. Katniss and Peeta find Effie's description of Haymitch very amusing because they understand more of where Haymitch comes from and also that his drunkenness cannot really be cured by a couple of Capitol manners. And it's a rare moment of joy and of humor that they get before they go into the games because they aren't aware of the stakes yet. Not until Effie explains that that drunken goof who fell off the stage and is somewhat incoherent could be their only lifeline in the games. And then that man, Haymitch Abernathy, waltzes into the room, stumbling, and vomits. She hops in her pointy shoes around the pool of vomit and flees the room. Even when fleeing a scene, Effie Trinket is presented as someone dainty and graceful. She hops out of the room. She doesn't stumble out of it. She doesn't trudge out of it. Either way, she does not find it beneficial to her to be a part of this next conversation. Perhaps because there's no cameras at play, perhaps because it's not a part of her job description. Either way, it's not her problem. And that concludes chapter 3. On to chapter 4!